The taxi rolled to a stop at the curb of Maple Hollow Lane, and for a moment I could not make my hand reach for the door handle, because through the windshield I could see a strange car in my driveway, strange curtains hanging in the windows my late father had framed with his own hands, and a strange child's bicycle lying on its side on the porch where my son used to leave his. 5 years of dust and diesel and homesickness fell away from me in a single breath, and in its place came a cold, sick understanding that something was terribly wrong, because this was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and instead it felt like I had stepped into someone else's story by mistake. Before I tell you what I found on that porch, and what my wife had done while I was gone, and why it broke my heart before it healed it in a way I never expected, I want to ask you something, because I have a feeling you already know the answer. If you believe in kindness, if you believe people can make choices that look like betrayal on the surface but turn out to be acts of quiet, aching love underneath, if you believe in forgiveness and second chances and the kind of hope that survives even the darkest misunderstandings, then I would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, shared it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribed to our channel. We built this channel to be a place where real, honest, emotional stories are told the way they deserve to be told, and every single one of you who joins our community makes that possible. Now let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand who I was before you can understand what I found. My name is Grant Whitfield, and I grew up in a small town called Bellhaven, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and the diner on Main Street still used real cream in the coffee. My father, Walter Whitfield, built our house on Maple Hollow Lane with his own 2 hands back in the early 80s, board by board, nail by nail, working double shifts at the mill during the week and framing walls on the weekends. He used to tell me that a house built with your own sweat means something different than a house you simply buy, and I believed him, because I grew up watching him repair that roof every autumn with the same stubborn pride he brought to everything else in his life. When my father passed away, he left that house to me, and I promised myself I would never let it go, not for any price, not for any reason, because it was the last living piece of him I had left. I met my wife, Corinne, at a community fundraiser when we were both 24 years old. She was standing behind a folding table selling raffle tickets for the volunteer fire department, and she had flour on her sleeve from baking that morning, and when she laughed at something I said, she laughed with her whole body, the way people do when they are not afraid of being seen. We were married 2 years later in the backyard of that same house on Maple Hollow Lane, under the oak tree my father had planted the year I was born. Corinne was not a flashy woman. She did not need diamonds or vacations or grand declarations. What she needed, and what she gave in return without asking, was steadiness, the kind of quiet devotion that shows itself in small things, a warm meal on a cold night, a hand on your shoulder when you cannot find the words yourself. We had our son, Theodore, 3 years into our marriage, and for a while, life felt simple in the way that only young families believe life can be simple. But simple does not always mean easy, and by the time Theodore turned 6, our small manufacturing town had begun to hollow out the way so many small towns do. The plant where I worked as a maintenance technician cut back hours, then cut back staff, and within 18 months I found myself unemployed with a mortgage, a young son, and a wife who was picking up extra shifts at the hospital laundry just to keep the lights on. I remember sitting at our kitchen table one night, staring at a stack of unpaid bills, and feeling for the first time in my life like I was failing the people I loved most. That was when an old coworker of mine, a man named Desmond Faraday, called me with an offer. He had moved overseas years earlier to work in the shipbuilding yards near Rotterdam, and he told me the pay was nearly triple what I could make back home, even after accounting for the cost of living. It would mean leaving my family behind for long stretches, working in a remote industrial zone with limited internet access, coming home only once or twice a year if the contract allowed it. I remember Corinne's face when I told her about the offer. She did not cry, and she did not beg me to stay, though I think some part of her wanted to. Instead, she took my hands across that same kitchen table and told me that we would find a way to make it work, because a family that loves each other can survive distance, but a family that loses its home has nothing left to hold on to. I did not know then how prophetic those words would become. I left for Rotterdam 3 weeks later, on a grey October morning, with Theodore clinging to my leg at the airport and Corinne standing a few feet away with her arms wrapped around herself, trying so hard to be brave for both of us. I promised her I would call every Sunday. I promised her I would come home the moment the contract ended. I promised her that this sacrifice would be worth it, that in 5 years we would have paid off the mortgage entirely, built up savings, maybe even helped Theodore start a college fund. What I did not fully understand, standing in that airport terminal with my heart splitting in 2 directions, was how much could happen in 5 years, how much a person could change, how much a town could change, and how much love could be tested by circumstances neither of us could have predicted. The first 2 years overseas were the hardest of my life, not because of the physical labor, though the shipyards were brutal in ways I had never experienced, but because of the loneliness. I lived in a dormitory with 11 other men from 6 different countries, and most nights I fell asleep listening to the distant clang of machinery and the low murmur of languages I did not understand. I called Corinne every Sunday like I promised, and we talked about Theodore's school projects, about the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, about the neighbors and the weather and all the small ordinary details that somehow felt like lifelines across an ocean. I sent home nearly every paycheck, keeping only enough to feed myself and cover my dormitory fees, because every dollar I saved felt like a brick laid toward the life we were building together. Then, in the 3rd year, something happened that I would not fully understand until much later. My phone calls with Corinne began to shift. She still spoke to me every Sunday, but there were pauses in her voice that had not been there before, hesitations, moments where I could hear her choosing her words with unusual care. I asked her once if everything was all right, and she told me that things were simply busy, that Theodore had joined a soccer league, that her mother's arthritis had gotten worse and she was helping care for her more often. I believed her, because I had no reason not to, and because a man 3,000 miles away learns quickly that he cannot fix problems he cannot see, so he learns instead to trust. What I did not know, because Corinne chose not to tell me over a crackling international phone line where every word had to be measured against the cost per minute and the fear of worrying me while I was so far from home, was that our town of Belhaven had been struck by a catastrophic flood in the spring of that 3rd year, the worst flood in nearly 60 years, when the river that ran along the eastern edge of town overflowed its banks after 3 days of relentless rain. Whole neighborhoods were submerged. The elementary school gymnasium had to be converted into an emergency shelter. And on Willow Creek Road, less than half a mile from our own home, a young widow named Denise Hargrove watched the floodwaters rise through the windows of the small rental house where she was raising her 3 children alone, after her husband had died 2 years earlier in a workplace accident at the very same mill where I had once worked. I need to tell you something about Denise Hargrove, because her story is woven so tightly into what happened to my house that you cannot understand one without the other. Years before the flood, when Theodore was still a toddler, Corinne had taken him to the community pool one scorching July afternoon. While Corinne was distracted for less than a minute, gathering towels from the car, Theodore had wandered toward the shallow end and slipped beneath the surface. It was Denise Hargrove, then a stranger to us, a young mother sitting nearby with her own infant daughter, who noticed the small shape beneath the water and pulled him out, breathing air back into his tiny lungs before the lifeguard even reached them. Corinne never forgot that moment. She told me about it during one of our earliest conversations as a couple, her voice trembling even years later, and she always said that she owed Denise Hargrove a debt she could never fully repay, a debt measured not in money but in the simple, staggering fact that our son was alive because a stranger had chosen to act. So when the flood came, and Corinne learned that Denise Hargrove and her 3 children, ages 11, 8, and 4, had lost nearly everything they owned, watching their rented home condemned by the county inspector days later due to structural damage and mold, something in Corinne refused to sit still. She drove to the shelter at the elementary school gymnasium and found Denise sitting on a cot with her youngest daughter asleep against her shoulder, her older 2 children clutching garbage bags containing the only clothes that had survived the water. Corinne told me, much later, that in that single moment, looking at the woman who had saved her son's life now sleeping on a cot in a school gymnasium with nothing left in the world, she understood with absolute clarity what she needed to do, even though she also understood how impossible it would be to explain it to me from across an ocean. Corinne invited Denise and her children to stay with her and Theodore in our house on Maple Hollow Lane while they searched for a new place to live. What was meant to be a temporary arrangement, perhaps a few weeks, stretched into months, because Denise's insurance claim was denied on a technicality, because rental housing in Belhaven was scarce and expensive in the aftermath of the flood, because every landlord Denise approached wanted first and last month's rent plus a security deposit that a woman working 2 part-time jobs simply did not have. Corinne watched Denise apply for assistance program after assistance program, watched her get turned away again and again, watched her children start to lose the small, stubborn hope in their eyes that children carry even in hardship, and Corinne could not bear it. It was Corinne's mother, a sharp and practical woman named Eleanor, who first mentioned the county's emergency housing transfer program, a little-known provision created after the flood specifically to help displaced families gain stable, permanent housing by allowing property owners to formally transfer a secondary or underutilized residence into a qualifying family's name, with significant tax relief and county-backed mortgage assistance attached to the transfer. Eleanor had read about it in the local paper, buried on page 9 beneath the football scores, and she mentioned it to Corinne almost in passing, never imagining her daughter would seriously consider it. But Corinne could not stop thinking about it. Our house, after all, was solely in her name on the deed, a decision my father had made years earlier for tax and inheritance reasons before he passed, transferring the property to Corinne rather than to me directly, believing it would simplify things if anything ever happened to him. Corinne alone held the legal power to transfer that deed, and she alone would have to live with the consequences of that choice. I want you to sit with that fact for a moment, because it matters enormously to everything that happens next in this story. Corinne did not sell our house. She did not gamble it away, or lose it to some scheme, or give it to a stranger on a reckless whim. She looked at the woman who had saved her son's life, watched that woman's children shiver through another cold night in a shelter cot, and made the single hardest decision of her life, choosing to give away the only physical inheritance her husband had left from his father, in the desperate hope that I would understand, someday, why she had done it. She did not tell me. Not because she wanted to deceive me, but because she was terrified, terrified that I would be devastated, terrified that I would feel she had no right to make such a decision without me, terrified that our marriage, already stretched thin across an ocean of distance, might not survive the weight of what she had done. So Corinne made a different plan instead. She would move herself and Theodore into her mother Eleanor's small 2-bedroom house on the other side of town, work extra shifts at the hospital laundry and pick up weekend cleaning jobs to save every dollar she could, and she would wait for me to come home in person, so she could look me in the eyes and explain everything, rather than let something this enormous crack apart over a telephone line that already carried so much distance between us. She believed, with the stubborn faith of a woman who loved her husband deeply, that if she could just hold on until I was home, we would find a way through it together. What Corinne could not have predicted was that my contract in Rotterdam would be extended unexpectedly by nearly 18 months due to a shipping delay crisis that required experienced technicians to remain on site, and that the remote industrial compound where I lived would lose reliable internet access for months at a time due to infrastructure damage from a separate storm system that battered northern Europe that same year. Our Sunday calls became monthly calls, then became calls that depended entirely on whether the compound's single satellite connection happened to be functioning. I sent money home faithfully every month through a wire transfer service, money that Corinne, in a decision that still brings tears to my eyes when I think of it, used almost entirely to help Denise Hargrove's family get back on their feet, covering the cost of the property transfer's legal fees, helping repair storm damage the flood insurance would not cover, buying school supplies and winter coats for 3 children who had lost everything, while Corinne and Theodore lived modestly in Eleanor's spare bedroom, sleeping on a pull-out couch that creaked every time either of them turned over in the night. I finished my contract in Rotterdam on a bright September morning, 5 years almost to the day after I had first left, and I did not tell Corinne I was coming home early. I wanted to surprise her. I had imagined this moment 10,000 times during 10,000 lonely nights in that dormitory, walking up the front steps of Maple Hollow Lane, knocking on the door I had painted myself the summer before I left, watching Corinne's face crack open into that laugh I had missed more than anything else in the world. I had a small velvet box in my jacket pocket, a modest eternity band I had saved for over the past year, wanting to mark our anniversary of survival, 5 years apart and still together. I took a taxi straight from the airport, my duffel bag still smelling of jet fuel and salt air, my heart pounding with an excitement I had not felt in half a decade. And that is how I found myself standing on the sidewalk outside my own house, staring at a strange car in the driveway, a child's bicycle on the porch that was not my son's, and curtains in the window that were not the curtains my wife had hung. I walked up the driveway on legs that did not feel entirely like my own, and I knocked on the door of the house my father had built. A woman I had never seen before opened it, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and behind her I could see a young boy doing homework at the kitchen table where my own son used to do his homework, at the table that had belonged to my grandmother. The woman's expression shifted from polite confusion to something like alarm as she took in the sight of me, a stranger with a duffel bag and hollow eyes, standing on what was now her porch. I asked her, my voice barely steady, whose house this was, and she told me, gently, as though she could sense the ground shifting beneath my feet even before I could, that her name was Denise Hargrove, that she had lived here with her 3 children for almost 2 years now, and that the deed had been legally transferred to her by a woman named Corinne Whitfield. I do not remember walking back down that driveway. I remember standing on the sidewalk with my duffel bag at my feet, staring up at the roof my father had repaired every autumn of my childhood, feeling something inside my chest collapse in on itself, a mixture of grief and fury and a disbelief so total that it felt almost like vertigo. 5 years. 5 years of loneliness, of backbreaking labor in a foreign shipyard, of missing my son's birthdays and my wife's laughter and every ordinary Tuesday I would never get back, and somehow, in that time, the one fixed point I had been holding on to, the promise that I would come home to my house, my family, my life exactly as I had left it, had simply dissolved without my knowledge or my consent. I want to be honest with you, because this story only means something if I am honest about the ugliness that lived in my heart in that moment. I thought terrible things. I thought Corinne had betrayed me, that perhaps she had fallen in love with another man and given away our home in some desperate attempt to rebuild a life without me. I thought about the money I had sent home every single month, money I had earned through backbreaking 12-hour shifts in freezing dockyards, and I wondered with a bitterness that shamed me even as I felt it whether that money had funded some life I knew nothing about. Grief has a way of curdling into anger when it has nowhere else to go, and standing on that sidewalk, 5 years of accumulated loneliness poured out of me in the form of rage rather than sorrow, because rage, at least, felt like something I could hold on to. I did not know where to go. My phone had no service yet, since I had not activated my local plan after landing, and I stood there on Maple Hollow Lane like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own former life, until an elderly voice called out from the yard next door. It was Ruth Callahan, our old neighbor, a widow in her 70s who had lived beside our house since before I was born, and who had known my father, and who had watched Theodore take his first wobbly steps across her front lawn. Ruth recognized me instantly despite the 5 years and the exhaustion carved into my face, and she must have seen something terrible in my expression, because she came down her porch steps faster than I had ever seen a woman her age move, and she wrapped her arms around me right there on the sidewalk, the way she used to hug me when I was a boy who had scraped his knee. Ruth brought me inside her house and sat me down at her kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I had eaten cookies as a child while my father fixed her leaky pipes for free because that was simply the kind of neighbors we were to each other. She made me a cup of tea I did not drink, and she told me, piece by piece, everything she knew, though she made clear from the very beginning that she believed there was far more to the story than what appeared on the surface, because she had watched Corinne with her own eyes over the past 2 years. And she refused to believe the woman she had watched work herself to exhaustion was capable of the kind of betrayal my imagination had already convicted her of. Ruth told me about the flood, about Denise Hargrove and her children losing everything, about Corinne moving out to live with her mother Eleanor across town, about the whispered rumors in Belhaven that Corinne had given away her own home to help a stranger, rumors that half the town admired and half the town could not quite believe. Ruth also told me something else, something that cracked the anger in my chest just slightly enough to let a sliver of doubt creep in. She told me that in all the months since Corinne had moved out, she had never once seen Corinne enjoy a single luxury, never a new car, never a vacation, never so much as a new coat, that instead Corinne had taken on a second job cleaning offices downtown in the early mornings before her shift at the hospital laundry, that she had watched Corinne walk to work in the rain because she could not afford to keep gas in her car for anything but the necessities, and that just last month, Ruth had seen Corinne turn down an invitation to her own sister's birthday dinner because she could not afford a gift and was too proud to show up empty-handed. This was not the picture of a woman living a secret, indulgent life funded by another man. This was the picture of a woman who had given away everything and was quietly, stubbornly, paying the price for it alone. I asked Ruth for Eleanor's address, and she gave it to me, along with a long, steady look that told me she expected me to listen before I spoke, to understand before I judged. I walked the 11 blocks to Eleanor's house because I needed the time to try to steady the storm inside my own chest, past the hardware store where I used to buy nails for my father, past the diner with the real cream in the coffee, past a town that had gone on living and changing in my absence while some frozen part of me had expected it to stay exactly as I left it. By the time I reached Eleanor's small blue house with its tidy front garden, I did not know whether I was walking toward forgiveness or toward the end of my marriage, and that uncertainty terrified me more than anything I had faced in 5 years overseas. I knocked on Eleanor's door, and it was not Eleanor who answered, but Theodore, my son, 11 years old now instead of the 6-year-old boy I had left behind, taller than I had imagined, with a gap where his front tooth used to be and a look of such stunned, disbelieving joy on his face that it nearly broke me apart on the spot. He shouted my name so loudly that I heard chairs scraping inside the house, and then he threw himself into my arms with the total, unguarded love that only children still allow themselves to feel, and I held him so tightly I was afraid I might hurt him, breathing in the smell of his hair, feeling 5 years of absence collapse into a single, overwhelming moment of homecoming, even as the rest of my homecoming remained shattered and unresolved just a few feet behind him. And then I saw Corinne standing in the doorway. She looked older than the woman I had left 5 years earlier, not in a way that diminished her, but in a way that told the story of every hour she had worked and every worry she had carried alone. There were new lines around her eyes, and her hands, when I finally looked at them, were rougher than I remembered, marked by the kind of labor that comes from scrubbing floors and folding endless hospital linens. But her eyes, when they met mine, held the exact same steadiness I had fallen in love with on the day I first saw her selling raffle tickets with flower on her sleeve. For a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Theodore, sensing something enormous passing between his parents that he did not fully understand, quietly stepped back, and Eleanor appeared behind Corinne, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder as though bracing her for whatever was about to happen. I asked Corinne, my voice cracking in a way I did not expect, why she had given away our house without telling me. I asked her how she could have made a decision that enormous, that permanent, without so much as a single word of warning across 5 years of phone calls. I told her that I had stood on that sidewalk an hour earlier feeling like the last 5 years of my life, every lonely night, every missed birthday, every backbreaking shift in that freezing shipyard, had been for absolutely nothing, because the one thing I thought I was building toward, our home, our future, had simply vanished while I was too far away to stop it. I was not gentle. I was not fair. I said things in that doorway that I regretted the moment they left my mouth, because grief and exhaustion and jet lag had stripped away every ounce of patience I usually tried to carry, and what remained was raw and wounded and lashing out at the person standing closest to the pain. Corinne did not raise her voice back at me, and she did not flinch away from my anger, though I could see it costing her something to stand there and absorb it. Instead, she asked me to sit down at Eleanor's kitchen table, the same request Ruth had made an hour earlier, and something in the quiet steadiness of her voice made me sit, even though every instinct in my body wanted to keep standing, keep shouting, keep pouring out 5 years of accumulated loneliness into the shape of blame. And then Corinne told me the whole story, from the beginning, the flood, Denise Hargrove pulling our drowning son from the community pool all those years earlier, the shelter cots, the denied insurance claims, the county transfer program Eleanor had read about in the newspaper, the months of secretly working 2 jobs to survive while every dollar I sent home went toward helping a family who had lost everything rebuild their lives in the very house my father had built. She told me she had tried, more than once, to tell me over the phone, and had lost her nerve every single time, terrified of breaking my heart from 3,000 miles away with no way to hold me while I absorbed it, terrified that distance would turn a hard truth into an unbridgeable wound. She told me she had promised herself she would explain everything the moment I came home, in person, where she could see my face and I could see hers, where we could work through it together rather than let it fracture apart over a crackling phone line. She had not expected me to come home 5 months early and unannounced, and she had certainly never imagined I would learn the truth first from a stranger answering the door of what used to be our house, rather than from her own mouth, in her own words, in a moment she had spent 2 years quietly rehearsing. I sat at that table for a long time without speaking, turning her words over in my mind, feeling the anger inside me shift and crack and rearrange itself into something far more complicated than simple fury. I thought about my father, and what he always said about a house built with your own sweat meaning something more than a house you simply buy. I thought about Denise Hargrove, a woman I had met for less than 60 seconds on a porch, who had once reached into a swimming pool and pulled my drowning son back into the world with her own 2 hands, asking nothing in return, expecting nothing in return, simply acting because a child was in danger and she was the one close enough to help. I thought about 3 children sleeping on shelter cots, losing not just their home but every small object that had ever made a house feel like theirs, a favorite blanket, a drawing taped to a refrigerator, the particular creak of a bedroom door they had learned to recognize in the dark. And I thought about Corinne, sleeping on a pull-out couch in her mother's spare bedroom for 2 years, walking to work in the rain, turning down her own sister's birthday dinner because she could not afford a gift, never once spending a single dollar of the money I sent home on anything but the family she had chosen to save. I realized, sitting there at that small kitchen table with my tea gone cold in front of me, that the woman across from me had not betrayed our marriage at all. She had lived out the exact values my own father had tried to teach me my whole life, that a house is not truly yours unless you are willing to use it for something larger than your own comfort, that love without sacrifice is simply convenience wearing love's name. Corinne had made the hardest, loneliest, most selfless decision of her entire life, and she had made it without a single ounce of certainty that I would ever understand or forgive her for it, and she had carried that uncertainty alone for 2 years because she loved me too much to risk breaking my heart over a phone line she could not reach through to hold me afterward. I reached across the table and took her hand, the rough, work-worn hand of a woman who had scrubbed hospital floors at 5 in the morning so that a widow and her 3 children could sleep under a roof that no longer belonged to her. I told her I was sorry for the things I had said in Eleanor's doorway, sorry that my first instinct upon learning the truth had been anger rather than trust, sorry that 5 years of distance had apparently been enough to make me forget, even for a single terrible hour, the fundamental goodness of the woman I had married. Corinne cried then, for the first time since I had arrived, not from sadness but from a relief so total it seemed to unlock something she had been holding rigid in her chest for 2 long years, and Theodore, watching from the hallway where he had been standing quietly this whole time, ran forward and wrapped his arms around both of us at once, as though he could physically hold his family back together through the sheer force of an 11-year-old's love. That evening, after the tears had settled and Eleanor had made us all a simple dinner of roast chicken and potatoes that tasted, to me, like the finest meal I had ever eaten, Corinne asked me if I wanted to walk back over to Maple Hollow Lane with her, to meet Denise Hargrove properly, to see with my own eyes the family who now called my father's house their home. I will admit I hesitated. Some small, stubborn part of me still ached at the thought of walking up that driveway as a visitor rather than an owner, still mourned the loss of the physical inheritance my father had left me. But I thought again about what my father used to say, and I thought about the boy doing homework at my grandmother's old kitchen table, and I told Corinne yes, I wanted to go. We walked back to Maple Hollow Lane together as the late afternoon sun slanted gold across the sidewalks, Theodore walking between us holding both our hands the way he used to when he was very small, and when we reached the house, Denise Hargrove opened the door before we even knocked, her face immediately apologetic, clearly having pieced together, through the small-town grapevine that moves faster than any news channel, exactly who I was and what had happened on her porch earlier that day. She began to apologize, her voice trembling, telling me she had offered more than once to move her family elsewhere once they were back on their feet, that she never meant to take something that belonged to another family, that she had cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count wondering if she had done something terribly wrong by accepting Corinne's help. I stopped her gently and told her that she had nothing to apologize for, that she had saved my son's life with her own 2 hands years before any of this happened, and that a family who gives so much of themselves to help another family, expecting nothing in return, is not a family who has done something wrong. I told her that my father built this house believing that a home should be a place where people are protected and cared for, and that somewhere, wherever he was, I believed he would be proud that his house had become exactly that for a family who needed it desperately. Denise's eyes filled with tears, and behind her, I saw her 3 children peeking around the door frame, the same 3 children who had once slept on shelter cots with nothing but garbage bags of salvaged clothing, now standing in a warm kitchen that smelled like dinner cooking on the stove, in a home that was legally, permanently, unshakably theirs. Over the following weeks, something began to shift in our small town of Belhaven that none of us could have predicted. Word of what had happened, of Corinne's sacrifice, of Denise's gratitude, of my own difficult journey from anger to understanding, spread through the community the way stories do in small towns, from the diner counter to the church pews to the hardware store checkout line. Ruth Callahan, it turned out, had quietly been telling anyone who would listen about the reunion she had witnessed on her own front lawn, and something about the story seemed to touch a nerve in a community that had spent the past several years watching its economic foundation crumble, watching neighbors struggle silently rather than ask for help, watching the kind of quiet generosity that used to define small-town life become rarer with each passing year. A group of neighbors, led by Ruth and by the pastor of the small Methodist church at the edge of town, a soft-spoken man named Pastor Nathaniel Corwin, began organizing what they called a community rebuilding effort, not just to help Corinne and me find a new home of our own, but to help repair the lasting damage the flood had left across several other families in town who had never fully recovered. Local contractors donated their labor on weekends. The hardware store donated materials at cost. A group of teenagers from the high school volunteer club spent their Saturdays clearing debris and painting fences. It became, over the course of that autumn, less about any single family and more about an entire community remembering what it meant to take care of its own, the way Belhaven had always prided itself on doing before hardship had worn everyone down into isolated survival. Corinne and I decided, together, that we did not want to take the house on Maple Hollow Lane back from Denise Hargrove and her children, even though the community rebuilding effort would have made that financially possible. We had long conversations about it, sitting together on Eleanor's back porch in the evenings while Theodore did his homework inside, and we came to understand something important about ourselves in the process, that the house itself had never been the true inheritance my father left me. The true inheritance was the values he had lived by, the belief that what you build with your own hands should be used to shelter and protect the people who need it most, and that belief had been carried forward, fully intact, in the decision Corinne made while I was thousands of miles away. Taking the house back, even legally, even understandably, would have undone the very thing that made my father's legacy meaningful in the first place. Instead, with the help of the community rebuilding effort and the savings I had managed to preserve from my years overseas, Corinne and I built a new home on a small plot of land at the edge of town that had belonged to Corinne's grandfather, a modest 3-bedroom house with a wide front porch and a yard big enough for Theodore to finally have the dog he had been asking for since he was 7 years old. We did not build it alone. Neighbors who had never met us before that autumn showed up on Saturday mornings with hammers and coffee thermoses, and I found myself, for the first time in 5 years, working alongside other men in the daylight of my own hometown rather than the freezing gray dockyards of a foreign country, and there was a particular kind of joy in that labor that I had forgotten was possible, the joy of building something not for a paycheck but for a family, surrounded by a community that had chosen to show up. Denise Hargrove and her children became close friends of ours over that year, in a way I never could have predicted standing on that porch in stunned fury 5 months earlier. Her oldest daughter, Marisol, began babysitting Theodore on the evenings when Corinne and I both had to work late, and her youngest, a small, fierce girl named Adeline who was only 4 when the flood took her home, grew so attached to Corinne that she began calling her Auntie Corrie, without anyone teaching her to. Denise herself found steady work managing the front office at the elementary school, a job Corinne had encouraged her to apply for, and slowly, visibly, the haunted, apologetic look that had lived behind her eyes since the flood began to fade, replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing and knew, now, that she had people around her who would not let her fall again. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Have you ever had to choose, in your own life, between what felt safe and what felt right? Have you ever made a decision that the people who loved you most did not understand at first, a decision that cost you something enormous and asked you to trust that the truth would eventually make itself clear? If this story is touching something in you right now, I would love for you to leave a comment below and tell us about a moment in your own life when kindness asked you to sacrifice something you thought you could not live without, or a moment when someone else's quiet sacrifice changed the entire direction of your life. Our community here loves hearing these stories from each of you, because every single one of them reminds the rest of us that we are not as alone in our struggles as we sometimes feel. The months that followed our reunion were not without their difficulties, because rebuilding trust after a wound like that does not happen overnight simply because both people want it to. There were nights when I still felt a flicker of old resentment rise up in my chest, usually late at night when I could not sleep and my mind wandered back to that moment on the sidewalk outside my father's house, and there were nights when Corinne confessed to me that she still carried guilt for the 2 years of secrets she had kept, even though I had told her, over and over, that I understood and had fully forgiven her. We went, at Pastor Corwin's gentle suggestion, to a handful of counseling sessions with a marriage therapist in the next town over, not because our marriage was broken beyond repair, but because we both wanted to make sure that the foundation we were rebuilding was even stronger than the one that had existed before, strong enough to withstand whatever distance or hardship life might ask us to endure in the future. Those sessions taught me something I had never fully understood before, which was that trust is not simply the absence of secrets, but the presence of a shared belief in each other's fundamental goodness, even when circumstances make that goodness hard to see clearly. I realized that my anger on that sidewalk had come not from any real doubt about Corinne's character, but from the terror of feeling powerless, of realizing that an ocean of distance had left me unable to protect the things I loved most, and that fear had disguised itself as suspicion because suspicion felt more bearable than helplessness. Corinne, in turn, came to understand that her silence, however well-intentioned, had cost me something too, that even the most loving sacrifice needs to be shared rather than carried alone, because a marriage is built on the belief that hardship is meant to be faced together, not endured separately and revealed only once the danger has passed. By the time winter arrived in Belhaven that year, our new house at the edge of town was finished, a modest but sturdy home with a front porch wide enough for the whole family to sit together on summer evenings, and a yard where Theodore's new dog, a scruffy rescue mutt he named Biscuit, chased fallen leaves in wide, joyful circles. We held a small housewarming gathering the weekend before Christmas, and I remember standing in the doorway watching the people who filled our new home. Ruth Callahan settled in the best armchair with a cup of cider, Eleanor and Pastor Corwin deep in conversation by the fireplace, Denise Hargrove's 3 children playing some elaborate game with Theodore in the living room while Denise herself helped Corinne in the kitchen, laughing over something I could not hear from across the room, and I felt something settle inside my chest that I had not felt fully settled since the day I first boarded that plane to Rotterdam 5 years earlier. I thought, standing in that doorway, about my father, and about the house he built with his own hands, and I understood finally, completely, that he had not simply left me a building made of wood and nails and shingles. He had left me an example, a way of understanding what it means to build a life around the people you love rather than around the things you own, and Corinne, without ever having met him, had honored that example more faithfully in my absence than I think even I would have managed had I been the one standing in her shoes. The house on Maple Hollow Lane still stands today, and Denise Hargrove and her children still live there, and every autumn, Denise sends us photographs of the leaves changing color in the yard my father used to rake every October, and every time those photographs arrive, I feel a quiet, grateful ache in my chest, knowing that the house is exactly where it needs to be, sheltering exactly the family it was always meant to protect. Theodore is 13 now, taller than his mother, still fiercely proud of the story of how his parents nearly lost each other and found their way back through honesty and forgiveness rather than through easy answers. He tells the story sometimes to his friends, in the exaggerated, dramatic way that 13-year-old boys tell family stories, and I have overheard him more than once describing it as the day his dad came home from across the ocean and learned that his mom was the bravest person he had ever met, and every time I hear him say it, I have to walk quietly into another room so he does not see the tears in his father's eyes. Marisol Hargrove, who is nearly 17 now, has become something like an older sister to Theodore, and last spring, she asked Corinne to help her fill out her first college applications, wanting to study nursing, telling anyone who would listen that she wanted to spend her life helping people the way people had once helped her family when they had nothing left. I stayed in Belhaven after that reunion. I never went back overseas. I found work eventually at a manufacturing plant 2 towns over, closer than the mill I had once worked at, and though the pay is not what it was in Rotterdam, it is enough, because I learned, in the most painful and unexpected way possible, that enough is a different measurement than I once believed it to be. I no longer measure my worth as a husband and father by the size of the paycheck I bring home or the value of the house I own. I measure it now by the number of ordinary Tuesday evenings I get to spend at my own kitchen table, watching Theodore struggle through his math homework, watching Corinne hum quietly to herself while she cooks, watching Biscuit the dog beg shamelessly for scraps beneath the table, all of it small and unremarkable and utterly precious in a way that 5 years of loneliness taught me never to take for granted again. Before I close this story, I want to ask you to do something meaningful for me and for our growing community here. If this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you that the people we love are capable of a depth of sacrifice we sometimes cannot see clearly until we understand the full picture, please leave a comment below sharing what this story meant to you, or what lesson you are carrying with you as you finish watching it. Perhaps it is a reminder to trust the people who have earned your trust, even when circumstances look confusing or painful on the surface. Perhaps it is a reminder that kindness given freely, the way Denise Hargrove once reached into that swimming pool without a second thought, has a way of returning to us in forms we could never have predicted. Whatever this story stirred in you, our community would be honored to hear it in your own words, because these stories only carry their full meaning when they become part of a larger conversation among people who believe, as we do, in second chances. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. We pour so much care into finding and telling these stories because we believe that in a world that often feels rushed and disconnected, there is enormous power in slowing down to remember what really matters: family, forgiveness, and the quiet, unglamorous acts of love that hold our lives together even when we cannot see them clearly in the moment. Every like, every comment, every share helps more people find their way to stories like this one, and every single person who joins our family here by subscribing becomes part of the reason we are able to keep telling them. Looking back now, years removed from that terrible, disorienting afternoon on the sidewalk outside my father's house, I understand that the story was never really about a house at all, though it took me the length of an ocean and the breaking and rebuilding of a marriage to understand it fully. The house was simply the shape that love happened to take, a wooden and nail-bound vessel for a much larger truth about what my father tried to teach me and what my wife, without ever meeting him, understood instinctively in her bones, that we are given homes not to hoard for ourselves but to open, when the moment demands it, to whoever needs shelter most. I came home from 5 years overseas expecting to find my life exactly as I had left it, and instead I found something far more valuable: a wife whose courage had outpaced my own, a son who had grown into a boy who understood forgiveness before I did, a stranger-turned-friend whose gratitude reshaped an entire community, and a lesson about what it truly means to come home, not to a building, but to the people who have been quietly, faithfully, sacrificially waiting for you all along. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you from our story today, it is simply this: that the people who love us are sometimes capable of a courage so quiet we mistake it for absence, and that the truest homecoming any of us will ever experience has very little to do with 4 walls and a roof, and everything to do with the hearts that never stopped holding a place for us, no matter how far away we traveled, or how long we were gone.